The camera lights were already hot, the applause still echoing, and the smile on Billie Eilish's face looked steady, until one question lingered just a beat too long. In that pause, on live television, something shifted. Not a scandal, not a meltdown, but a tension you could feel through the screen. Subscribe to Prime Talk, give a thumbs up, and share your thoughts in the comments below. This is the story of Billie Eilish sitting down with Stephen Colbert, just days after one of the most talked about Grammy moments of her career, a speech that sparked debate, admiration, backlash, and headlines across the industry. What was expected to be a reflective late-night conversation quietly turned into something more pointed, more revealing, and more uncomfortable than anyone anticipated. And because it happened live, there was no cutting away from the silence, no softening the moment, and no rewriting the narrative afterward. Late-night talk shows are carefully choreographed spaces. They are designed to feel casual, even intimate, while operating under strict timing, prepared questions, and an unspoken agreement between host and guest. Keep it moving, keep it light, keep it safe. Stephen Colbert, a veteran of live television and one of the sharpest interviewers in American media, understands this better than most. His desk is not just a piece of furniture, it's a control point. A place where humor, intellect, and moral inquiry intersect. Billie Eilish, on the other hand, has never fit neatly into the expected rhythm of celebrity interviews. From the moment she entered the public eye, she has resisted polish in favor of honesty. Her career has been marked not only by chart-topping success, but by a consistent refusal to perform gratitude on command or dilute her discomfort for the sake of likability. At award shows, in press rooms, and on global stages, she has spoken openly about pressure, exploitation, and the contradictions of an industry that celebrates youth while consuming it. The Grammys speech that preceded this interview was not long, but it landed hard. In it, Billie acknowledged her peers, expressed gratitude, and then stepped slightly outside the expected script. Viewers interpreted her words in different ways. Some heard humility, others heard frustration, and many sensed a deeper critique aimed not at individuals but at the system surrounding them. Social media reacted instantly. Clips circulated. Think pieces followed. The tone of the discourse shifted from celebration to scrutiny almost overnight. By the time Billie walked onto Stephen Colbert's stage, this context was unavoidable. The audience applauded as she took her seat. She smiled. Colbert smiled back. The exchange began as these interviews always do, warm, respectful, even playful. They spoke about the whirlwind of awards season, the surreal nature of recognition, the strange emotional whiplash that follows a major win. To a casual viewer, nothing seemed out of place. But live television has a way of revealing cracks not through confrontation, but through timing. Stephen Colbert is not known for ambushes, but he is known for asking the question that viewers are already thinking. And on this night, the question hovering over the conversation was not whether Billie deserved her accolades, but whether she was comfortable with what those accolades represented. Her Grammys speech had reopened an old conversation about authenticity, obligation, and the emotional cost of success, especially for artists who rise young and fast. As the interview progressed, Colbert gently steered the conversation closer to that moment. Not directly. Not yet. He referenced the speech in passing. He acknowledged the reaction to it. He framed it as something that had clearly resonated with people watching at home. Billie listened carefully. Her posture changed subtly. Shoulders squared. Hands folded. The energy shifted from celebratory to contemplative. This is where live television becomes unforgiving. There is no commercial break to reset the mood. No retake to soften phrasing. Every second stretches exactly as long as it feels. And for an artist whose public persona is built on emotional transparency, the risk of being misunderstood is always present, especially when the conversation turns from achievement to intention. The stakes in that moment were not about reputation alone. They were about control. For Stephen Colbert, the challenge was to ask a question that honored the seriousness of Billie's words without reducing them to a headline. For Billie Eilish, the challenge was to respond in a way that remained truthful without becoming defensive, knowing that millions were watching in real time and that any hesitation would be replayed, analyzed, and interpreted far beyond the studio walls. What made this exchange matter was not volume or drama. It was restraint, the absence of interruption, the space between words, the awareness, on both sides, that this was not just another late-night appearance. Live television has produced countless viral confrontations, raised voices, walk-offs, shock moments that dominate the news cycle. This was different. This was quieter, and in many ways, more revealing. It exposed how easily a celebratory moment can transform into a referendum on authenticity, and how even the most carefully navigated career can be reshaped by a single, unscripted response. As the interview moved closer to its pivotal question, the audience grew quieter. Laughter faded. The rhythm slowed. Billie's Grammys speech, something already behind her, suddenly felt present again, hanging in the air between host and guest. The conversation was no longer about what she had won, but about what she believed. And that is when Stephen Colbert leaned slightly forward, framed his words carefully, and asked the question that would define the rest of the night. Not confrontational on its surface, not accusatory, but direct enough to demand a real answer. What happened next unfolded in real time, with no edits, no safety net, and no way to take it back. And to understand why that moment landed the way it did, we have to go back, before the applause, before the speech, and before the expectations placed on Billie Eilish long before she ever stepped onto a Grammy stage. To understand why that moment on Stephen Colbert's stage carried so much weight, you have to rewind well before the studio lights turned on, back to the space Billie Eilish occupied in the public imagination leading up to that interview, and the tension that had been quietly building around her long before the Grammys. By the time Billie Eilish arrived at that awards ceremony, she was no longer just a successful artist. She was a symbol of youth, of vulnerability, of artistic credibility in a hyper-commercialized era. And symbols, once created, are rarely allowed to evolve without resistance. Billie's rise had been unusually fast and unusually scrutinized. From her earliest releases, she was positioned as an outsider who somehow broke through the center. Critics praised her for rejecting traditional pop aesthetics. Fans connected deeply with her openness about mental health, body image, and the isolating nature of fame. Industry insiders framed her as proof that authenticity could still win at the highest level. But with each milestone came a heavier expectation, to remain grateful, grounded, and agreeable, no matter how overwhelming the attention became. In the months leading up to the Grammys, Billie was everywhere. Interviews, performances, red carpets, studio appearances. Every word she spoke was documented, clipped, and debated. She was praised for being honest, but also criticized whenever that honesty sounded anything less than celebratory. The line between sincerity and perceived dissatisfaction became increasingly thin. Award season intensified that tension. The Grammys, in particular, occupy a complicated space in American music culture. They are both a celebration and an institution, one that has been criticized for decades over issues of representation, artistic relevance, and internal politics. Billie herself had previously benefited from the platform, sweeping major categories early in her career. That history made her presence at the ceremony symbolically loaded. She was no longer the newcomer. She was part of the establishment she once stood outside of. And that contradiction mattered. When Billie stepped up to the microphone on Grammy night, expectations were clear. Gratitude, humility, a nod to peers, a smooth exit. Instead, while she did all of those things, she also introduced something less comfortable, a tone that suggested conflict rather than closure. Her words were measured, not explosive, but they carried an undercurrent that audiences picked up on immediately. Some interpreted her speech as a critique of the system. Others heard exhaustion. Some saw bravery. Others saw ingratitude. The conversation fractured quickly. Online, clips of the speech circulated without context. Headlines framed it in competing ways. Was Billie calling out the industry? Was she questioning the legitimacy of awards? Was she uncomfortable with winning? Each interpretation said less about what she explicitly said and more about what people expected her to say, and how she failed to conform to that expectation. Billie did not rush to clarify. That silence became its own statement. In the days that followed, she continued with scheduled appearances, including her stop on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. By then, the interview was no longer just another press obligation. It was positioned, quietly but unmistakably, as a moment of potential clarification. A chance for her to explain herself. Or to be explained. Stephen Colbert's role in this context was unique. Unlike a traditional journalist, he operates at the intersection of satire, sincerity, and moral inquiry. His interviews often feel conversational, but they are carefully constructed to surface larger cultural questions. When he engages with artists, especially after public controversy, he tends to ask questions that reflect the audience's uncertainty rather than his own judgment. That made the pairing significant. Colbert's audience is attentive, politically aware, and sensitive to cultural nuance. Billie's audience is younger, deeply online, and protective. The overlap between those groups is not automatic. Bringing Billie into that space, so soon after a speech that unsettled public narratives, guaranteed a certain level of friction, even if no one raised their voice. Behind the scenes, nothing suggested a confrontation. The interview was promoted normally. There were no reports of tension. No last-minute cancellations. On the surface, it was business as usual. But context has a way of sneaking into conversations, even when it isn't explicitly invited. And Billie knew that. She arrived poised, dressed simply, projecting calm. But this was not a victory lap. This was a checkpoint. A moment where the story around her could either soften or sharpen. Every response mattered, not because she owed anyone an explanation, but because the cultural machine surrounding her was already producing one without her input. The pressure was subtle but constant. Answer too carefully, and she would be accused of backtracking. Answer too emotionally, and she would be labeled ungrateful. Refuse to engage, and silence would be read as confirmation. This is the paradox that often confronts artists who speak honestly. Once you break the expected script, you are expected to explain the break again and again, in formats not designed for complexity. By the time Billie sat across from Stephen Colbert, the Grammys speech had taken on a life of its own. It was no longer just a moment, it was a reference point. One that hovered behind every light-hearted question and every polite exchange. As the interview unfolded, viewers could sense that the conversation was circling something unresolved. Colbert acknowledged the reaction to her speech without immediately dissecting it. Billie responded with restraint, choosing her words carefully, aware that this was live television, unfiltered, irreversible. The mood remained respectful. But beneath it was an unspoken understanding. Eventually, the conversation would have to go there. And when it did, there would be no way to frame the answer after the fact. The turning point wasn't marked by raised tension or dramatic music. It was marked by a shift in pacing. A longer pause. A quieter audience. A question introduced not as an accusation, but as an invitation to clarify something the public had already begun to define for her. That invitation, once extended, could not be ignored. And when Stephen Colbert finally asked it, directly, calmly, and live, the room changed. The moment did not arrive with fanfare. There was no dramatic shift in lighting, no audible gasp from the audience, no sudden change in tone that announced what was coming. It arrived quietly, in the way only live television can, through timing. Stephen Colbert sat behind his desk, papers aligned, posture relaxed. Billie Eilish sat across from him, angled slightly toward the host, her hands resting together in her lap. The conversation had slowed naturally, as late-night interviews often do when they move away from anecdotes and toward meaning. The laughter had thinned. The applause signs were dark. Colbert referenced the Grammys again, this time without detail. He did not quote the speech directly. He summarized its impact instead, acknowledging that many viewers felt it carried more weight than a typical acceptance speech, that people were still talking about it days later. His voice remained even, measured. The phrasing was careful, almost deliberate, as if each word had been placed to avoid misinterpretation. Then he asked the question. It was framed as curiosity, not challenge. A single sentence, calmly delivered, asking Billie what she had hoped people would understand from her words on that stage, and whether the reaction that followed aligned with that intention. The question hung in the air. For a brief moment, Billie did not answer. This was not interruption, not hesitation born of confusion. It was a pause. Her eyes dropped slightly, then lifted again, not to Colbert, but somewhere just past the camera line. Her shoulders rose with a breath she did not rush. The studio, which had been filled with sound just seconds earlier, went quiet enough that the absence of noise became noticeable. Live television does not allow for compression. Every second passed exactly as it occurred. Billie adjusted her posture, shifting forward just a fraction. Her hands, previously still, moved, one thumb pressing lightly into the other. It was a small gesture, but visible. Colbert did not speak. He did not fill the space. He waited. The audience waited with him. When Billie began to respond, her voice was steady, but softer than before. She spoke slowly, choosing words with care, as if aware that this answer would be replayed, transcribed, and interpreted far beyond the studio walls. She did not rush to clarify or defend. She did not redirect the question. She addressed it directly. As she spoke, her expression remained composed, but serious. There was no smile, no performative ease. Her gaze alternated between Colbert and the middle distance, suggesting focus inward rather than outward. She explained the mindset she had been in at the time of the speech, the emotions she had carried with her onto the stage, and the complexity of standing in a moment meant for celebration while feeling something less simple internally. There were no sweeping gestures, no raised voice, no rhetorical emphasis, just measured sentences, delivered in real time. Colbert listened without interruption. His hands were folded, his head tilted slightly, signaling attention rather than judgment. He did not nod excessively. He did not interject with humor. The desk between them felt less like a barrier and more like a boundary, marking the seriousness of the exchange. At one point, Billie paused again mid-sentence. This pause was shorter, but more noticeable. She took another breath, exhaled, and continued. The audience remained silent, not prompted, not instructed. The absence of laughter or applause was not awkward. It was attentive. The kind of quiet that forms when people sense they are witnessing something unscripted. This was the reality of live broadcast. There was no cutaway to the band. No reaction shot to ease the tension. No opportunity to trim the silence in post-production. Every hesitation stayed. As Billie continued, she acknowledged the range of interpretations that followed her speech without endorsing or rejecting them. She did not attempt to control the narrative. She described the disconnect between how a moment feels when you are inside it and how it is later framed from the outside. Her body language remained restrained. Her shoulders stayed level. Her hands returned to stillness. The calmness of her physical presence contrasted with the emotional weight of the subject matter, creating a tension that the camera did not miss. Colbert waited until she finished speaking before responding. When he did, his reply was brief. He did not summarize her words or challenge them. He acknowledged the difficulty of communicating nuance in public moments and thanked her for addressing it directly. His tone remained neutral, reflective. There was no attempt to escalate the exchange. But the impact had already settled. What made the moment resonate was not confrontation, but exposure. The exposure of uncertainty, of emotional complexity, of the limits of language under pressure. And because it happened live, the authenticity of that exposure could not be questioned. The camera lingered for a beat longer than usual. Billie looked back at Colbert. Colbert held her gaze. Neither spoke. Then, smoothly, Colbert transitioned the conversation forward, signaling a return to safer ground. The band did not play. The audience did not applaud immediately. The show moved on, but the atmosphere had changed. Viewers at home had witnessed something rare, not a clash, but a moment where a public figure navigated a difficult question without insulation. No edits. No corrections. No narrative cleanup. In the world of late-night television, where timing is precise and unpredictability is minimized, this exchange stood out precisely because it resisted resolution. There was no clear takeaway offered. No headline-ready quote delivered on cue. Just a question, an answer, and the silence in between. And that silence, broadcast live, carried more weight than any scripted confrontation ever could. Live television ends when the camera's cut, but its consequences don't. When The Late Show moved on from that segment, the studio reset almost instantly. Lights shifted. Energy recalibrated. Another guest, another conversation, another controlled exchange. But for viewers at home, and for the media ecosystem that monitors moments like these in real time, the interview was far from over. Within minutes, clips began circulating. Not dramatic clips, not explosive sound bites, but fragments, Billie's pause, the question, the silence, the measured response. In a digital environment conditioned to reward outrage and immediacy, this moment stood out precisely because it resisted simplification. There was no clear winner. No viral confrontation. No obvious misstep. And that ambiguity made it harder to process, and more compelling to analyze. Commentary emerged quickly, but cautiously. Some viewers praised Billie's composure, noting how rare it is for a young artist to sit with discomfort on live television rather than deflecting or performing ease. Others focused on the pressure embedded in the question itself, debating whether artists should be expected to explain emotional complexity in formats designed for entertainment. Still others zoomed in on Colbert's role, not as an aggressor, but as a proxy for public curiosity that had been building since Grammy night. What was notably absent was consensus. Media coverage reflected that uncertainty. Headlines avoided inflammatory language. Articles described the exchange as tense, quietly revealing, or unexpectedly introspective. Analysts replayed the moment frame by frame, not to catch a mistake, but to understand the dynamics at play, how tone, timing, and silence can shape perception more powerfully than words. For Billie Eilish, the interview subtly shifted the narrative. Before the appearance, discussion around her Grammys speech had been speculative. People argued about what she meant. After the interview, the conversation became more grounded in what she said, and, equally important, in how she said it. The live format had stripped away the possibility of overproduction. Viewers were left with an unfiltered interaction that resisted easy interpretation. That mattered. In celebrity culture, clarity is often demanded, not because it leads to understanding, but because it allows for categorization. Gratitude or defiance. Humility or arrogance. Victim or critic. Billie's response fit none of those neatly. And in refusing to resolve the tension, she challenged the expectation that public figures owe the audience emotional closure. Stephen Colbert's handling of the moment was also widely noted. Rather than steering the conversation toward humor or reframing the exchange with commentary, he allowed the silence to stand. In doing so, he signaled that the question and the answer were meant to be absorbed, not adjudicated. That restraint reinforced his role not as a provocateur, but as a facilitator of reflection, even when reflection is uncomfortable on a live broadcast. Industry observers pointed out how rare that approach has become. Late-night television, once a space for extended conversation, has increasingly leaned into speed and virality. Interviews are clipped for social media, optimized for punchlines, and designed to travel far beyond their original context. This exchange resisted that machinery. It demanded full attention. And as a result, it traveled more slowly, but more deeply. Behind the scenes, there was no public fallout. No statements were issued. No clarifications released. No apologies offered. That silence was telling. Billie did not attempt to reframe the moment through social media. She did not post excerpts or explanations. Colbert did not revisit the exchange in a monologue or segment. Both parties allowed the interview to exist as it had occurred, complete, unresolved, and intact. For fans, this approach was reassuring. For critics, it was frustrating. But for observers of media dynamics, it was instructive. The moment demonstrated how live television still holds power, not because it guarantees spectacle, but because it removes control. When neither side can edit, the exchange becomes a record rather than a product. And records invite interpretation rather than consumption. In the days that followed, discussion gradually shifted. The Grammys speech receded slightly from focus, replaced by broader conversations about emotional honesty, artistic pressure, and the expectations placed on young performers in legacy institutions. Billie's interview became a reference point, not as a scandal, but as an example of how public discourse can pause instead of explode. That pause was the lasting impact. It reminded audiences that not every confrontation needs escalation to be meaningful. That discomfort, when handled with restraint, can reveal more than conflict ever could. And that silence, especially on live television, is not always a failure of performance, but sometimes a reflection of truth resisting compression. Moments like this don't trend forever. They don't dominate cycles for weeks. But they linger in a different way. They resurface in retrospectives, in discussions about media ethics, and in comparisons to interviews that chose spectacle over substance. And for Prime Talk, moments like these are why we pay attention, not just to what is said, but to how it unfolds and what it reveals about the machinery of fame, media, and expectation. If you're finding value in these deep dives into unedited live television moments, make sure you stay connected with the channel, because the most revealing confrontations are often the quiet ones. What remains now is perspective. With distance, the interview reads less like a turning point and more like a checkpoint, one that captured an artist and a host navigating a cultural moment in real time, without certainty, without control, and without retreat. And that brings us to the final question. What this moment ultimately tells us about live television, celebrity vulnerability, and why a single question, asked at the wrong or right time, can still alter everything. In the fast-moving world of celebrity news, most moments are built to burn bright and disappear just as quickly. They spike, trend, and fade, replaced by the next controversy before the previous one has time to settle. But every so often, a live television moment resists that cycle, not because it was loud, but because it was honest enough to linger. The exchange between Billie Eilish and Stephen Colbert belongs to that category. With distance, it becomes clear that this was never about winning an argument or exposing a flaw. It was about friction between expectation and reality, between what audiences want public figures to represent and what those figures are actually experiencing in real time. Live television has always carried this risk. Unlike pre-recorded interviews, it offers no insulation. The performer cannot retreat behind edits. The host cannot refine intent after the fact. What happens is what happened. And in this case, what happened was a reminder that authenticity does not always arrive in a clean, quotable package. Billie Eilish entered that interview at a specific point in her career, no longer an emerging artist, but not yet afforded the emotional distance that legacy performers sometimes enjoy. She was young enough to be scrutinized for tone, but established enough to be held accountable for symbolism. That is an uncomfortable position, especially in an industry that often demands emotional accessibility without offering emotional safety. Stephen Colbert's question did not create that pressure. It revealed it. The power of the moment lies in how little was forced. There was no escalation, no correction, no insistence on clarity. Instead, the exchange exposed a truth that many live interviews unintentionally obscure: that some experiences cannot be neatly translated, especially when they involve conflicting emotions like gratitude and discomfort existing at the same time. In celebrity culture, contradiction is often treated as failure. Audiences expect coherence. They want public figures to feel one thing at a time, to communicate it efficiently, and to align it with a narrative that feels satisfying. Billie's response disrupted that expectation. She did not resolve the contradiction. She acknowledged it. And in doing so, she shifted the responsibility back to the audience, to sit with complexity rather than demand resolution. That is rare. It also explains why the moment continues to be revisited, even without scandal attached to it. It offers a case study in how media, fame, and youth intersect under pressure, and how live television can briefly strip away performance to reveal something closer to process. For Stephen Colbert, the interview reinforced a different kind of credibility, not as a host who delivers confrontations, but as one who understands when not to overstep. By allowing silence to remain unfilled, he preserved the integrity of the exchange. He trusted the audience to recognize significance without instruction. That trust is increasingly uncommon. Most televised moments today are engineered for immediacy, designed to be clipped, captioned, and consumed in isolation. This moment resisted that design. It required context. It demanded patience. And because of that, it offered insight rather than spectacle. The Grammys speech that set everything in motion has since become part of Billie Eilish's larger narrative, but the Colbert interview remains distinct. It wasn't a rebuttal or a clarification. It was a snapshot of an artist navigating expectation in real time, with no filter and no guarantee of being understood. And that may be its most lasting contribution. It reminds us that live television, at its best, is not about confrontation for its own sake. It is about presence. About what happens when a carefully managed public image encounters an unscripted question at precisely the wrong, or right, moment. One question did not alter Billie Eilish's career overnight. It did not redefine Stephen Colbert's legacy. But it altered the tone of the conversation, if only briefly. It slowed it down. In an era obsessed with certainty, that slowdown is meaningful. And that is why moments like this deserve closer examination. Not because they explode, but because they expose. Not because they end careers, but because they illuminate the space between who celebrities are expected to be and who they are allowed to be on camera. If you've made it this far, you understand why Prime Talk focuses on these unedited, live moments, the ones that don't shout for attention, but earn it through restraint. If you haven't already, subscribe to Prime Talk, hit the like button, and share your perspective in the comments. Did this moment change how you viewed the interview, or how you see live television itself? Because sometimes, the most powerful confrontations aren't defined by what's said loudly, but by what's said carefully, live, and without a second chance.